Beginning here in Section 31, we're going to take a deeper dive into the topic of sanctions and embargoes, noting that the title here is Multilateral Sanctions, U.S. Support of United Nations Resolutions. As such, we should note from the get-go that we're not talking about unilateral U.S.-specific sanctions, but multilateral, as put forth by the United Nations. So we're talking about the United States and how it works as a member state of the UN to put forward and enforce sanctions and embargoes. The body within the United Nations that imposes and monitors sanctions against designated countries is called the UN Security Council. One can hear about this from time to time on the news. The UN Security Council proposed this resolution. The UN Security Council took X measure. Of all the UN entities, it's probably one of the more recognizable in general terms. But it is the UN Security Council that is involved in sanctions and embargoes. That Security Council, first sub-bullet point, is made up of 15 countries. The authority to put forward sanctions resides within the Security Council, but it's called the Security Council Committee. Any decision to impose sanctions and or embargoes are based on UN resolutions. One of the member countries makes a proposal and says for XYZ reason, there should be this specific sanction or a full-on embargo against a specific country. It's a proposal and a member vote. As noted in the last bullet point, any resolution that is adopted, a vote that wins, all these resolutions are expected to be implemented by all United Nations member states. A country that belongs to the United Nations is referred to as a member state. The essence of the UN, whether one is talking about the UN Security Council or any other organization within the UN umbrella, is that member states will respect what the group agrees to. That is the essence of being a member state. That is why it's so important for member states to recognize and enforce sanctions and embargoes. Otherwise, they wouldn't work. We talked about a number of different sanctions, economic and or trade related, that can be taken against a country. The UN sanctions really focus on 4 areas, and we'll show how in just a moment. But arms embargoes for sure, keeping arms out of the wrong people's hands. Asset freeze, we also talked about that, where multiple countries will freeze the assets of an embargoed or sanctioned nation. Trade sanctions and travel ban. Travel bans on North Korea are a good example of that multilateral approach, in this instance to a sanction specific to a travel ban. Moving on with the power of the Security Council Committee, they are indeed empowered to implement and facilitate designated sanctions against a country. So not only can they vote on a resolution, they can make it happen as well. It's implementation. Quick trade tip, we pretty much mentioned this already. The U.S. is a member of the Security Council and supports UN-mandated sanctions and embargoes. In fact, the U.S. is probably one of the bigger sponsors of resolutions that lead to sanctions and embargoes. Here's an export perspective we'd like to use to illustrate this point about UN Security Council sanctions. In this particular instance, against Libya. So the source we'll note on the lower right-hand side is the UN Security Council website. And pretty telling, actually, as it breaks down the specifics of sanctions against a specific country. So we're looking at the Security Council Committee established pursuant to Resolution 1970 concerning Libya. What we're really most interested in is what we see in sanctions measures. But since we're on the page, and it's a good resource to have, let's run through some of the other information as well. Different things, starting on the left-hand side. Sanctions list materials, resolutions, as we spoke of a moment ago, committee guidelines, any exemptions. We'll see that as we get further into this example as well. Press releases, panel of experts, implementation reports, how well a sanction is doing, as well as annual reports on sanctions too. Let's have a deeper look at these sanctions measures specifically related to the 4 areas that we spoke of in the previous slide. So it's broken down by measure, description, and exemption. Arms embargo, that was one of the first of the 4 that we saw. What's the description? All member states are required to prevent the sale or supply to Libya of arms and related materials of all types, including weapons and ammunition, military vehicles and equipment, paramilitary equipment, and spare parts for the aforementioned. Goes on to elaborate a bit further. There are also exemptions to the right. set out in paragraph 9B of Resolution 1970, protective clothing, including flak jackets and military helmets, temporarily exported to Libya by United Nations personnel, representatives of the media, and humanitarian development workers and associated personnel for their personal use only. So when you see a reporter on the news from Libya and they're wearing a flak jacket, that's how they were able to get the flak jacket into the country. Let's move on and look at the next slide, which elaborates even further on the Libya sanctions measures. This is actually a continuation of the previous slide. Travel ban, that was another of the 4 types of sanctions that we looked at. All member states are required to prevent the entry into or transit through their territories of all listed individuals. And there will be a list of individuals. Right below that, assets, freeze, and business restrictions. All member states are required to freeze all funds, other financial assets, and economic resources that are owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the listed individuals or entities, actual people or organizations. No funds, financial assets, or economic resources to be made available to or for the benefit of such individuals or entities. Goes on to read a little bit further. Clearly, we'd have to check the list, but we've already talked about arms, travel ban, asset freeze, and business restrictions. On the right-hand side, specific to Libya because it is an oil-rich state, measures in relation to attempts to illicitly export crude oil. The flag state of a designated vessel is required to direct the vessel not to load, transport, or discharge crude oil from Libya, limiting or eliminating the ability of Libya to export oil and keep U.S. dollars out of their hands. But important to mention, the sanctions in place absent direction from the government of Libya focal point. All member states are required to prevent the entry into ports of designated vessels designated by the committee from entering their ports. And on it goes. But the purpose here to illustrate the types of sanctions that are focused upon, and as it relates specifically to a country, how they are implemented and ultimately enforced over time. So a good example of how things like arms embargoes, travel bans, asset freezes, and in the case of Libya, illicit export of crude oil, are really put forward and made to stick. So a good illustration there. We're going to switch over here and now talk about U.S. government sanctions and embargoes and the actions that the U.S. government takes through its multiple agencies to support UN sanctions or its own unilateral sanctions. Let's jump into that topic. One will note on the right-hand side, we've put up the images of several government agencies. We want to visually illustrate the point that yes, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, is definitely involved in the enforcement of sanctions and embargoes, but it's not just OFAC. There are several. Let's talk about them. Depending on the nature of a product, service, or financial transaction, a number of U.S. government agencies can be involved in the enforcement of sanctions and embargoes. For example, BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security. We should be well familiar with them by now. Department of State, for certain, especially related to defense-related products. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and OFAC, as we mentioned a moment ago. So depending on the nature of the product, different agencies are going to be involved in the enforcement of sanctions and embargoes. As a best practice, the screening of export transactions must include checks against any sanctions or embargoes. We're going to talk about screening of export transactions, restricted party screening, to use a term that may be more familiar to some people online. But the beginning, middle, and end of any transaction, any export transaction, screening has to be taking place. And as a best practice, the screening of export transactions should definitely include checks against any sanctions or embargoes. More on that and more on how to do that as we proceed. Quick export perspective. We mentioned a couple of times the role of OFAC as it relates to sanctions and embargoes. Very important. So let's stop here, give them a little love, and then we'll come back to OFAC in greater detail later on. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, falls under the U.S. Department of the Treasury, as we see in their logo. Second bullet point, their primary function is to administer and enforce sanctions against countries, regimes, governments, or at least they call themselves governments, terrorists, actual individuals, international narcotics traffickers, individuals as well, and those engaged in other activities that threaten the U.S. So an all-encompassing basket statement at the end of that bullet point. But countries, regimes, terrorists, narcotics traffickers, and anybody else that threatens the U.S., OFAC will have some involvement. But to reiterate, last bullet point, OFAC works in close cooperation with other USG agencies, U.S. government agencies, allied governments, and of course, the United Nations. Continuing on with our more general conversation on U.S. government sanctions and embargoes, sanctions can be the result of an executive order and are also backed up by specific legislation. An executive order coming from the Executive Office of the United States, POTUS, President of the United States. That's where an executive order comes from. But sanctions can also be backed up by specific legislation. Couple of examples here, not exhaustive, but a couple of examples of legislation. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The U.S. government uses that quite frequently. And then another one called the Kingpin Act, clearly related to narcotics trafficking. Important to note, as yet another resource, the details on sanctions and embargoes for the U.S. are published in the Federal Register. And then finally, sanctions information is also available on a number of U.S. government agency websites, as well as ECFR, which we've seen a bunch of times. But specific information from DDTC, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we can go straight to their websites as well. So Federal Register, ECFR, and agency-specific websites. There's really no excuse why sanctions and embargoes cannot be an integral part of a company's overall export compliance activities. There's just too much information out there not to. Quick example, and there are many, but this is off the U.S. Department of State website. It's an executive order example, 13382. We won't go into too much detail here, but just wanted to illustrate, really as a result of what we just stated, the number of resources that are out there to engage in these screening activities. Executive Order 13382, signed by the President on June 29, 2005, is an authority aimed at freezing the assets of proliferators of weapons of mass destruction and their supporters and isolating them financially. Designations under EO, Executive Order 13382, prohibit all transactions between the designees and any U.S. person and freeze any assets the designees may have under U.S. jurisdiction. There's a list of who they are. The point is this: we want to illustrate the resources that are out there to engage in these types of screening activities. Executive orders are a big part of that. This particular one, 13382, was about freezing assets of proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. Good example. Moving along, at any given time, there can be more than 25 different sanctions and embargoes in place. This is why we have to be aware, cognizant of all the different agencies and everything that they're involved in as it relates to sanctions. An important point to make in our second bullet point, and we'll see some examples of this forthcoming. Sanctions and embargoes can be selective or comprehensive. Selective meaning could be against certain aspects of a country, certain individuals or organizations in a country. It's a selective thing. Whereas comprehensive is to say, if for whatever reason the U.S. gets involved in an embargo against country X or sanctions against country X and it's comprehensive, it's across the board. Everything. Travel, arms, freezing of assets, all the things we've talked about. So in our sub-bullet points, selective sanctions target specific actions or people, whereas comprehensive applies to an entire country. Another important distinction to make is in our last bullet point. Sanctions and embargoes can also be blocking and or sectoral. Blocking meaning the blocking of assets or access to dollars across the board for a country, or by specific industry sector. We've seen that off and on for a number of years against Russia, for example, in the oil and gas sector. That's where the name sectoral comes from. Selective versus comprehensive, blocking versus sectoral. We as U.S. exporters, if we want to do business in countries that are subject to sanctions and or embargoes, we need to know the difference between each and every one and how they apply to the specific country that we're hoping to do business with. Let's wrap up this section with a list of U.S. government sanctions programs, albeit a partial list. We'll be jumping into some examples from some of these countries as we move forward. But in our first bullet point, examples of country-specific sanctions include Ivory Coast sanctions, Libya, we talked about that already, Somalia, and as of the recording date of this module, Ukraine-Russia sanctions. For a full list of all sanctions programs, one can click here, and you'll be pretty fascinated by what you find. It's rather important. We're going to pick back up here when we come back on the next section, starting out with an export perspective, continuing that brief discussion on Ukraine-Russia sanctions. We shall see you in a moment.